Abstract Thinking. What it is, why we need it, and when to rein it in. By Timothy J. Legg. Today we're obsessed with data. Experts in every industry are finding ingenious ways to measure and depict millions of data points every day. But data is virtually worthless unless someone can look at the numbers, detect patterns, analyze what those patterns mean, and develop narratives to explain them to everybody else. The difference between collecting data and understanding its meaning is the difference between concrete and abstract thinking. Abstract thinking is the ability to understand concepts that are real, such as freedom or vulnerability, but which are not directly tied to concrete physical objects and experiences. Abstract thinking is the ability to absorb information from our senses and make connections to the wider world. A great example of abstract thinking at work is humor. Comedians are experts in abstract thinking. They observe the world around them. They detect incongruities, absurdities, and outrages. And they build jokes out of the unexpected connections. How you use abstract thinking. Abstract thinking is considered a higher order reasoning skill. You use it when you create things, speak figuratively, solve problems, understand concepts, analyze situations, form theories, put things in perspective. Abstract versus concrete thinking. Abstract thought is usually defined alongside its opposite, concrete thinking. Concrete thinking is connected closely to objects and experiences that can be directly observed. An example of a task that involves concrete thinking is breaking down a project into specific, chronological steps. A related abstract thinking task is understanding the reasons why the project is important. Most of us need to use a blend of concrete and abstract thinking to function well in day-to-day life. How do we develop the ability to think abstractly? Abstract thinking skills develop as we grow and mature. Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget explained the way children's thinking abilities change as they get older. Piaget said that from birth until around the age of 2, babies and toddlers generally think concretely. They observe and explore the world around them using their 5 senses and motor skills. See the Cheerio on the floor, pinch it with your fingertips, and put it in your mouth. Decide you like it. Repeat the process. From ages 2 to 7, children develop the ability to think symbolically, which may be the foundation for abstract thinking. They learn that symbols like letters, pictures, and sounds can represent actual objects in the real world. From age 7 until around 11, kids develop logical reasoning, but their thinking remains largely concrete, tied to what they directly observe. Sometime around age 12 and continuing into adulthood, most people build on their concrete reasoning and expand into abstract thinking. This stage includes the growing ability to put themselves in other people's shoes, to use an abstract thinking metaphor, learning how to empathize. The exercise of empathy is considered an abstract thinking ability. Abstract reasoning in school. Many of the tasks students perform in school are tied to abstract thinking. Math skills are often abstract. They rely on the ability to conceptualize numbers and operations without always putting your hands on physical objects. The study of language often involves analyzing and expressing abstract ideas, making generalizations about human nature and conflict, and learning to write figurative comparisons like metaphors and similes. History, social studies, philosophy, and politics all require the ability to think generally about social problems and use ethical judgment. Science requires students to propose, test, and revise hypotheses and theories. Apart from the academic aspects of school, navigating the complex social situations presented during a typical school day also involves abstract thinking. The benefits of abstract thinking. People who are able to think abstractly are often good at taking intelligence tests, solving complex problems, creating art of all types, coming up with novel options and directions, divergent thinking. How to improve abstract thinking. If you want to improve your abstract thinking skills, here are some things you can try. Easy ways to improve your abstract thinking. Improvise. If there's an improvisational theater group in your area, consider taking a workshop that allows you to explore this open-ended form of performance play. Solve puzzles. 3D, visual, and word puzzles will train you to think of alternatives beyond those that occur to you immediately. Build 3D models. Research trusted source has shown that people in science, technology, engineering, and math professions enhance their abstract thinking abilities by doing arts and crafts projects. Explore optical illusions. Some researchers trusted source use art and photographs with optical illusions to train students to see things in multiple ways, which is a hallmark of abstract reasoning. Play with figurative language. The ability to write similes, metaphors, analogies, and even pieces of personification can stimulate abstract thinking. Think of something concrete and relate it to something abstract. On the day he was sentenced, rain fell continuously, as if justice were weeping. Or, the psychologist made a sexist remark, saying women's minds were like bowls of spaghetti. Conditions that may limit abstract reasoning. Some neurological conditions may interfere with your ability to think abstractly. Autism spectrum disorder. Researchers' trusted source have found that some people with autism spectrum disorder may have trouble with concepts and problem solving. Schizophrenia. Some forms of abstract thinking, particularly those involved in interpreting social situations, trusted source may be limited by schizophrenia. Traumatic or organic brain injuries. Injuries from accidents and prenatal exposures, including fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, can impact the areas of the brain that make abstract thinking possible. Intellectual disabilities. Individuals with intellectual impairment often have difficulties using and understanding abstract thinking skills. Dementia. Often the parts of the brain involved in many types of dementia are the same parts that control abstract thinking skills. When abstract thinking isn't helpful, sometimes the ability to imagine, predict, and make connections interferes with healthy functioning. Take the cognitive distortion known as catastrophizing, for example. If you habitually imagine worst-case scenarios, you may increase your anxiety level or worsen depression symptoms. Overgeneralization is another example. If you experience a setback as proof that you're a failure, your ability to generalize is reaching an inaccurate and counterproductive conclusion. Research trusted source has shown that this kind of abstraction is common with anxiety and depression. If you have one of these conditions, you may find that abstract thinking is occasionally problematic. The good news is that researchers have found that you can practice concrete thinking skills and use them to improve depression symptoms trusted source and even help you with decision-making trusted source during periods of depression. The takeaway. Abstract thinking is the ability to consider concepts beyond what we observe physically. Recognizing patterns, analyzing ideas, synthesizing information, solving problems, and creating things all involve abstract thinking. The ability to think abstractly develops as we mature, and we can intentionally improve our abstract thinking ability by improvising and playing with puzzles, models, and language. Striking a healthy balance between abstract and concrete thinking is important for maintaining good mental health and daily functioning. Concrete thinking. Building block, stumbling block, or both. Picture this. A noisy middle school classroom in which a teacher has just given the instruction, everybody hop up and change seats with your neighbor. Most of the students stand, move to another spot, and sit back down. But one kid is actually hopping. He's actually going to take his neighbor's chair. That kid might be the class clown, but he also might be a concrete thinker. He's taking the teacher's instructions literally. Concrete thinking is reasoning that's based on what you can see, hear, feel, and experience in the here and now. It's sometimes called literal thinking, because it's reasoning that focuses on physical objects, immediate experiences, and exact interpretations. Concrete versus abstract thinking. Concrete thinking is sometimes described in terms of its opposite, abstract thinking. This is the ability to consider concepts, make generalizations, and think philosophically. Concrete thinking is a necessary first step in understanding abstract ideas. First, we observe and consider what our experiences are telling us, and then we can generalize. Concrete thinking at different stages of life. Early childhood. All people experience concrete thinking. According to noted psychologist Jean Piaget, babies and young children go through predictable stages of cognitive development during which they gradually move from concrete to abstract thinking. From their earliest moments, babies are constantly observing their environments, learning primarily through their five senses. As they grow, they learn that they can interact with objects and people, getting predictable results. Shake the rattle and a noise happens. Toss the spoon to the floor, and someone picks it up. At this early developmental stage, from birth through about age 2, babies and toddlers think in terms of what they can observe. Babies lack object permanence. The idea that an object continues to exist even if we can't see or hear it. If the ball drops behind the couch, to an infant or toddler, it is gone. As children mature, they begin to think symbolically. A hand signal represents the idea of more or milk. They learn to express their desires with words, which are audible symbols of thought. Gradually, from the age of 2 to 7, they begin to develop the ability to reason and predict. Elementary school years. From around the age of 7 until approximately age 11, children still rely heavily on concrete thinking, but their ability to understand why others act the way they do expands. Child psychologists think this stage is the beginning of abstract thinking. From age 12 into adolescence, children gradually develop the capacity to analyze, extrapolate, generalize, and empathize. Adolescence and adulthood. As we mature, we gain experience. We're increasingly able to generalize about the things we've seen and heard. We use our concrete personal experiences and observations to form hypotheses, to predict, to consider alternatives, and to plan. It's at this stage that most people become skilled at inferring what other people will think and feel in a given situation. Conditions that can prevent or delay abstract thinking. Some conditions can cause delays in the development of abstract thinking. People with these conditions may rely heavily on concrete thinking, limiting their ability to think abstractly and perhaps affecting the way they socialize. Some of these conditions include: some studies trusted source have found that certain forms of abstract thinking, the ones related to understanding metaphors and other kinds of figurative language, may be more difficult in students with Klinefelter syndrome, certain intellectual disabilities, and autism spectrum disorders. These studies didn't find or imply that intelligence was lower, just that these particular abstract reasoning skills were a challenge. Risks of too much concrete thinking. People whose thinking is very concrete may find some situations or tasks harder as a result. These might include empathy. The ability to understand what other people feel and need requires you to be able to look and interpret facial expressions, body language, words, tones, and behaviors in a social context. Some people who think concretely may not read these social signals accurately. Creativity. Concrete thinkers may have difficulty problem solving or creating things, as abstract thinking and imagination may be required. Flexibility. Concrete thinkers sometimes stick to literal interpretations and rigid behaviors, and this inflexibility may cause some conflict with other people. Avoid idioms, metaphors, and analogies. A person who thinks concretely, for example, might not understand expressions like, "the ball is in your court," or, "don't put all your eggs in one basket." Be as specific as possible. It's better to say, "this must be finished by 5 p.m. on Wednesday," than to say, "I need this as soon as possible." Use photographs or illustrations. These literal objects may help you explain. Limit jokes and sarcasm. These forms of communicating can be hard to explain because they often rely on abstract ideas and plays on words. Anticipate differences in the ability to compare, categorize, and contrast. A concrete thinker might group things in concrete ways. When looking at photos of a wheelbarrow, a rake, and a hoe, a concrete thinker might point to a shared characteristic instead of describing the general function. They all have wooden handles, rather than, "you can use them all in the garden." The benefits of concrete thinking. Researchers have found that training people to think concretely can actually help in some situations. For example, one study trusted source showed that first responders and others whose jobs involve repeated exposure to trauma have fewer intrusive memories when they're trained to use concrete thinking during traumatic events. During a trauma, your ability to cope may be enhanced if you've been trained to think through what's actually happening, to examine the concrete causes, and to repeat the steps you need to take to resolve the problem or get out of danger. After a trauma, thinking concretely about these same things has been shown to help people build resilience and lessen the number of intrusive memories. In a 2011 study, people with depression were asked to think about a recent upsetting event. Researchers instructed the study participants to break down the event into concrete details and consider how those details influenced the outcome. Participants who used this concrete thinking strategy had reduced depression symptoms afterward. Researchers concluded that training in concrete thinking helped to counteract the depressive tendency to ruminate, worry, and come to unhealthy, inaccurate conclusions. Exercises to improve your concrete thinking. If you believe more concrete thinking could help you ruminate and worry less, talk to a therapist about exercises you could do to strengthen your concrete thinking abilities. Your therapist may work with you to develop a step-by-step process for looking at the warning signs, sensory details, decisions, and specific actions that took place during a negative event. By analyzing the concrete details, you can discover opportunities to change the outcome of future events. When faced with similar circumstances, you can activate the concrete thinking process to better handle the event. The bottom line: Concrete thinking is a kind of reasoning that relies heavily on what we observe in the physical world around us. It's sometimes called literal thinking. Young children thinking concretely, but as they mature, they usually develop the ability to think more abstractly. Thinking concretely is one of the hallmarks of autism spectrum disorder, dementia, schizophrenia, brain injuries, and some intellectual disabilities. People whose thinking is solely concrete may have some difficulties in social situations, but concrete reasoning does have some benefits. It may actually help some people cope with depression and trauma.